Welcome to the Crip Camp Workshop Keynote Speaker Panel. My name is Emma James, and I am the YES Program Manager at IARN USA. And I have the great honor of welcoming you all to today's very special event. And we're fortunate to have an incredible panel lined up to speak to you about the film Crip Camp and a broader conversation about disability rights, particularly in a global setting. I have a few quick housekeeping items. ASL interpretation is available, and we have our interpreter spotlighted. If you need ASL interpretation and you don't see the interpreter clearly, please send a message to in the chat box to me or my colleague Alexander, and we will change the format. The chat box settings are set so you can only send a message to the host or the panelist. So if you would like to ask the panelists any questions, please send a chat box message, and if time allows, we will ask some questions from the audience towards the end of our event. And finally, we do have closed captioning available. So to turn on closed captioning, you need to click the closed caption button at the bottom of your toolbar. So IARN was inspired to host this event after speaking with Andraéa LaVant, who you will all have the pleasure of listening to shortly. Andrea was the facilitator at a YES Program Inclusivity Workshop hosted in Ghana in October 2019. We reconnected with Andrea earlier in the spring about collaborating on another project, and that is when we first learned about her new role with the Netflix documentary Crip Camp. As most of you are aware, the film narrates the story of youth at a camp for persons with disabilities who become activists for the disability rights movement and fought for accessibility legislation. The film is an example of what resilience, a strong community, and belief for a cause can accomplish. My colleagues and I watched the film, and we knew that this was a storyline and experience that would resonate with ECA exchange students and alumni. So alongside Andrea, the idea of holding a Crip Camp workshop blossomed into a reality which has brought us all here today. Another significant reason why we are together is because we're celebrating an anniversary. 2020 marks 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in the United States. This landmark legislation prohibits discrimination based on disability and increases the opportunities and access for persons with disabilities. The law was written and passed to ensure that persons with disabilities have the same rights as other Americans. The legislation was passed in large part because of the activists like the ones shown in the film Crip Camp. So today we are joined by some of the leading disability advocates in the world, and a very familiar face if you watched the film Crip Camp. We currently have just about 100 attendees in the audience, and I know that there was over 50 countries represented in our registration. So before I disclose any more information about some of the incredible folks joining us, I do want to introduce you to our moderator, Cindy Lewis. Cindy is the Director of Programs for Mobility International USA, otherwise known as MIUSA, and it's a U.S. disability-led organization dedicated to advancing disability rights and leadership globally through international exchange and international development. MIUSA administers the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, which is a project of the U.S. Department of State designed to increase the participation of people with disabilities in international exchange between the United States and other countries.
And Emma, I will take the introductions from here.
Perfect.
Okay, are we ready? Shall we begin? Okay, well, thank you so much, Emma. And again, I want to welcome everybody to this, and thank you so much for organizing this to IARN. Before I introduce our panelists, I do want to mention that Mobility International USA, MIUSA, has been a partner of the State Department for 30 years. And so we really want to appreciate the long commitment that the Department of State has made to inclusion of people with disabilities in international exchange. And that includes, as Emma mentioned, our National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange. We hope you all go visit that. And also a long support of the Flex and YES program. So support to students with disabilities, host families, placement organizations on making sure that the Flex and YES programs are inclusive. So appreciation to Department of State for that. And with that, I want to introduce our very important and amazing guests. And I want to start with Judy Heumann. So Judy is an American disability rights activist, and I would guess that most of you on this call have heard her name even before Crip Camp. She is recognized internationally as a leader in the disability community. Judy is a lifelong civil rights advocate for people with disabilities and one of the key figures in passing the ADA, and she is featured strongly in Crip Camp, as I'm sure you all saw. Her work with governments and with NGOs since the 1970s has contributed greatly to the development of human rights legislation and policy benefiting people with disabilities and benefiting all of our country. Her work in the World Bank and the US Department of State has led to mainstreaming of disability rights into international development cooperation. And Judy has contributed greatly to the extension of the international reach of the independent living movement. Judy is the author of Being Human, and a great book that recounts her lifelong battle to achieve respect, acceptance, and inclusion in society. And then, so welcome, Judy. I also want to welcome Andraéa LaVant, and as Emma said, Andraéa is very much involved and kind of the spark behind this whole webinar. She's the founder and president of Levant Counseling and the Crip Camp Impact Producer, and she'll tell us more about that. Through her company, she teaches organizations how to include disability in their company's programs and campaigns. As a communications consultant and an inclusion specialist, Andraéa has over a decade of experience working with programs that support youth and adults with disabilities and other underserved populations. Her professional roles and personal advocacy have presented her with a variety of notable opportunities to share messages and prompt change for people with disabilities around the globe. And I want to just mention here, I need to just take a little teeny bit of credit for Andraéa's activism in claiming her as a MIUSA alumna. So Andraéa participated in a US Department of State sponsored exchange program that MIUSA coordinated with people of Jordan, women, right, Andraéa? Yeah. So welcome, Andraéa, thank you so much. And Ann Cody, another long-time well-known name in the international disability rights community. So Ann currently oversees the International Disability Rights Portfolio at the US Department of State. She is responsible for the department's engagement to combat discrimination and abuse against people with disabilities globally, and to promote the rights, respect, and full inclusion of all persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others. Prior to joining the State Department, Andraéa oversaw the Washington, D.C. office of Blaze Sports America, where she shaped the organization's policy efforts and helped lead its international initiatives. Ann is also a Paralympic gold medalist, so yay, claim that. And she has also held leadership positions in the highest level of the Paralympic movement with the US Olympic and Paralympic committees and the International Paralympic Committee and International Olympic Committee. So thank you, all three of you, to be here. I can't imagine a more star-studded but also really powerful panel to speak on this topic. So thank you all. And with that, I'm going to ask questions of our panelists, and sometimes all three of you might want to respond, sometimes just one or two of you. That's fine, and as Emma mentioned, save your questions, participants. And Emma, I'm sorry, did you want them to send questions now to the chat box or hold them till later? Unmute, Emma.
Yeah, they can send them whenever, but we will hold the questions until the end. Okay. And I will be monitoring the chat box throughout the webinar.
Okay, great, thank you. So everyone, if you have questions, go ahead, put them in the chat box, send them to Emma, and we'll come back to those questions at the end. Okay, are you ready, panelists?
Ready.
Excellent. Okay.
Andraéa, you're still muted.
Yep, get ready, Andrea, because this one starts with you. I want to hear from Judy and Ann too, but especially starting with you, Andrea. So let's start with a question about Crip Camp. So this film has been widely praised and obviously very well known for its depiction of people with disabilities. And I would say for its depiction of a really important civil rights movement. So I wanted to ask you and anyone else, why do you think this film has been so successful? A film about people with disabilities. Why? Why has it been so successful?
Well, you know, my favorite line in the film is actually within the first, couple of minutes, where the person says, would you like to, and because of the time that it was, he says, would you like to see handicapped people, which is the term that was widely used then, depicted as people? And so to me, that's the reason why the film is so widely loved, is that it shows all facets of life, and it's not from a pity standpoint. It's really from an empowerment place. And so it does show all of the kind of, for lack of a better word, the regular, but also it shows our power and the power of community. It shows, you know, what it looks like to, you know, come together and affect change. And the other reason why, you know, we hear that people love it so much is that it's unfortunately an unknown story for so many people. And so many people have just, oh my goodness, I can't believe I didn't know. How did I not know this? How did I not know this? You know? So I think that, I mean, there's so many reasons why the film is amazing, but, you know, based on what I've consistently heard, those are kind of the two pieces that really resonate, is the fact that people are so like wowed about the fact that all this was happening kind of up under so many of people's noses, and they didn't know. But then the fact that we as disabled people, you know, everything from relationships to, you know, independent living and everything in between. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Andrea. Judy or Ann, did you want to add to that?
I just want to add to what Andrea was saying and mention that the clips, the clips going back to the Gen Ed camp are so authentic and raw and real. And there's such a treasure, you know, a historical archive and treasure of people's lives and people with disabilities. I think it's so powerful for that reason, among the many that Andrea already talked about.
I think, you know, sorry, following up on what Andrea and Ann have been saying, when I talk to people about, you know, why they like the film, in addition to what Andrea and Ann were saying, they have mentioned things to me like the respect that the community gave to other people, the importance of listening to people. And I think for quite a number of people that I've spoken to, that was maybe a moment for themselves to think about how we don't necessarily listen to everyone. And I think what was particularly striking in the film is that it's a cross-disability film that also includes people who have speech disabilities. And there are at least 3 or 4 people in the film who have prominent roles who have speech disabilities, which is something which is really even more atypical than meeting people like Andrea, myself, and Ann. I also feel that people resonated to some other issues, like the issue of being dependent on other people and not being able to get alone space and time, like many people feel and take for granted. The discussion that occurred around the table with the campers where Nancy Rosenblum was speaking. And one of the things that she's talking about is, you know, not being able to get away from her family. She didn't use a motorized wheelchair, and she was very dependent on other people. And so she moved from Brooklyn to California and got involved with CIL, which really was the first time, that's not in the film, but she was a friend, I knew her from elementary school. That was the first time that she really was able to create her own environment and her own space. So I think there are a lot of nuances in the film. I also think it's important for people to realize that this film, in part, is what it is because of an opportunity that came about, and it was a fluke. The fact that video cameras were brought to the camp and 5.5 hours of footage came out. So, you know, there were many other camps going on in the United States at that time. There still are not as many. And I dare say if there would have been footage at other camps that would have been taken, it wouldn't have been the same story, but it would have been a similar story. So I feel, you know, for people who work for the State Department, one of the values is being able to document history. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, like, nobody was thinking in 1971 about, oh my goodness, we do this footage and it is going to be made into a film. As you see in the film, it was something that Jimmy started thinking about in 2014 or 15, and then had to track down that footage. But in many countries, including the US, we don't take advantage of footage that needs to be taken. And so, you know, for me, I see the public affairs offices and ECA people really looking at encouraging people with the devices that they have of taking footage of things that may or may not be anything significant in the future, but maybe could be. And that's one of the beauties about this film. Footage was there, they found it, and really were able to explode it.
That's great. Thank you, Judy. That is one of the things that I wondered every time I watched is, wow, what a miracle that they had this footage. So thank you for that. Okay, next question. Going from that. So many of the campers in Crip Camp later on noted how influential the camp had been in their development as activists. So, and also throughout the film, we witnessed many impressive grassroots activism actions and movements. So can you talk a little bit about a couple of things? The first, how can we foster more communities like Crip Camp, or that bring that opportunity to sit around the table and have discussions and be together and cross-disability conversations? How do we foster that today? And how do we, what are some lessons about activism that you would like viewers to take away? And just to clarify, when I say how can we foster more communities, I mean how can we foster communities that encourage civic engagement and activism? So who wants to start with that one?
Andrea, why don't you start?
Sure. So I think that one thing that we, you know, are demonstrating even today is that there is a lot of opportunity to build community in innovative and new ways. So, for example, we're meeting virtually, and the fact that that is an option right now, and honestly, bringing in a lot more than the disability community is actually a great thing, because it allows, it provides access in a way that we didn't have before. Even when you think about it, as disabled people, that you need, you know, whether it's need for PCAs, whether it's, you know, just inability to travel, like it's really cool because right now, digital activism is huge. I mean, just the power of hashtags and building, you know, Facebook communities and Twitter and Instagram and all of that. is one way. You know, for us, we've been hosting a summer series, Crip Camp, the official virtual experience. And when we originally were planning it, you know, we thought that we would be, you know, planning some in-person event, and we ended up deciding to move it to a virtual platform. And because of that, you know, whereas we may have had 50 people, we have almost 10,000 people that have signed up to join us on Sundays from around the world. And we've been meeting every single Sunday. We're going into our 14th week. And we talk about, I mean, we've had conversations on civic engagement, and, you know, we've had everything from this past weekend was on spirituality. So what's really cool is that there is now an opportunity to really connect in new ways, and I think, you know, there of course being together in person is a lovely thing, but I think that yeah, now we have opportunities to build community in ways that I believe are going to be and already are more inclusive.
Great, thank you. Judy or Ann?
Ann, you want to go?
Sure, thank you. Community is a really important thing, I think, for human beings. And we tend to look for community or build community around areas of interest and areas of need. And so that's where I find people with disabilities building community. I really developed my identity and network through sports, because I needed to get back involved in sports as a 16-year-old who was an athlete when I became disabled. And that was really powerful, because I was around other people with similar disabilities and life experiences to mine who also love sport. And I learned so much about disability, about my own disability and managing it, and disability rights and my rights, and the importance of advocacy, along with participating in sports, because that's just was one aspect of my life. So, you know, this is a very important thing, and it is exciting to see what's happening during this time, where we are engaging much more on the digitally, and Andrea talked about that, so I won't belabor it.
Thank you. Judy, did you want to add?
I think it's also important, as I know many of the embassies around the world are doing, is to really know who the people are in your community, who the disability leaders are in the urban and rural areas, small and large organizations, giving people opportunities to get the kind of support they may need to get the messages and the issues that they're working on more in the public view. Because I think, you know, when you look at one of the issues around Crip Camp, part of what was coming out, and still is today, is the lack of appropriate media coverage. People not knowing the issues that we as disabled people are articulating, and the types of changes that we believe need to be made. And so when I worked at the State Department, for me, one of the important messages really was to help empower the public affairs offices and other parts of the embassy our embassies around the world to really understand and meet with people, learn from the disability community and parent community when appropriate about what the real issues are. Don't just listen to the government. Obviously, listening to the government is important, but, you know, for me, having worked in the government and in civil society, there are different roles that people have to play at different times. So really allowing an opportunity for people to have open and genuine communications, I think, is very important. And some of the work, you know, that state does, like human rights reports and various other reports that are required on an annual basis, it's really working with the community, knowing trusted people in the community to help inform the work that you're all doing. Ultimately, I think, you know, what's important about the State Department, USAID, is really that one of your purposes is to really enable authenticity to rise to the top. And people understanding the disability movements in your countries, why they've evolved, what the barriers have been, what improvements have been made, what barriers, for example, now with COVID are rising again, what regression may be occurring, what can our embassies be doing to ensure that disability is an issue not only kept on the table for our embassies and consulates, but also to make sure that we are discussing disability with other civil society groups beyond just disability community and government agencies and the religious community and others. It's really make sure that this is an integral issue. And because of the work that has really been going on over the last 20, 30 years around the world with the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Disability Alliance and its members, we really have a much more robust community of people to work with. So I think we need to be working with those communities. We need to legitimize those communities, and we really need to help the general society benefit from the work that they're doing and learn about how our issues, for example, relate to disabled women, how they relate in areas of education and human rights, etc.
Okay, well, great. And Judy, actually that really morphs beautifully into, you've already kind of addressed, I'm going to kind of combine a couple questions here. So one, you just did talk a little bit about lessons about activism, but I want you to just think if there are other lessons about activism. And also, what strategies have been most effective for affecting changes for disability rights on a global scale? And some of the things that you just said, Judy, absolutely address that, working with other movements, making sure that the broader community is that both benefits from and understands disability rights movements, all the things that you just mentioned. But any other thoughts about, just from all of you, about what would you like to communicate about activism? I know lots of people who are listening are thinking, okay, great, but what can I do? So what are some lessons about activism, and what strategies have been effective at a global level for disability rights? So other thoughts on those things?
Well, I think one of the things that we've observed and experienced is the importance of bringing all people with disabilities together. It's an important strategy in terms of trying to change policies and legislation or introduce new laws and address deficiencies. People with all types of disabilities need to be working together, because quite often we're initially organized in a disability-specific or condition-specific silo. And what we learned in the US through the advocacy and disability rights work that's been done over the past 40 years is recognize that we all have to be together and working together as people with disabilities. So that's a key strategy for sure.
That's great, thank you. So take note, activists. How about you, Andrea? What else would you like to add?
Yes, so I think that, so there's a couple of things. One, to kind of support what Ann said and add a little bit is so there is that cross disability, and then there's also what Judy talked about a little bit ago, which is the cross movement overall. So when we're looking at different social justice movements, I know for us, one of the big emphases that we've had with Crip Camp over the past few months is not just connecting with disability organizations, but connecting with other social justice organizations. Like here, it's organizations that focus on Black Lives Matter, so that then we emphasize the fact that Black disabled lives matter. Looking at LGBTQ rights and connecting with organizations to think about how they're addressing disability within those spaces. And so I think that it's important to understand that whatever you're like passionate about, like focused disability, disabled people are in every single community, and that's actually what's great. And so it's important that we can that we focus on advocating for, or being an activist, depending on how you look at it, in every space that we are. And the other piece is recognizing that we really do all have a role to play. Some are the people that, and I know right now it's been in the US, it's been, we've been having these conversations because there have been so many protests going on about how we, in essence, kind of feel valuable, or like we're doing our part, because perhaps we are not able to be out in the streets doing, the formal protesting that people can see. But there really is a role for everyone to play. So that's whether that's, making phone calls, sending letters, whether that's, supporting on social media. I know there was a protest a month or so ago in DC around with the Black Disabled Lives Matter movement. And there were folks that were very clearly like the ones that were doing the tweeting and stuff like that. And then you had the people kind of on what you would consider to be the front line. So I think it's important for people to, recognize that there is absolutely space for you in the movement, and it doesn't have to look the same way for each person, but your voice matters no matter where it is.
I also think that it's really important that we look at ways to ensure that disabled people are getting jobs and are running for elected office. One thing you see in a number of countries, for example, in Africa, where their constitution requires that disabled individuals be elected to positions in their national government, that having disabled people in those positions can be very important because they're influencing the development of laws and budgets and implementation. Likewise, we need to be seeing disabled people that are being hired in our embassies and our consulates. And we also need to see disabled people being hired across the board in other organizations. And emphasizing what Andrea and Ann have been speaking about, the issue of cross-disability. Ultimately, the way we get to really advance our movement is not only to develop and strengthen our own movement, but also to ensure that other movements understand, as Ann and Andrea were also saying, that disability cuts across everything. So we need women, for example, to clearly understand that if we're looking at issues around violence against women, you're talking about women, some of whom already had disabilities, others of whom didn't, but any women that are experiencing sexual assault and trafficking and other kinds of violence, it is very likely that they will at least have PTSD and maybe others. And those people should not be alienated and cast aside in their communities. And the only way that gets addressed is by ensuring that the women's community not only is acknowledging and working on the problem, but is also looking at what are some of the multiple effects that are occurring to disabled women. Why is there a higher incidence of violence against disabled women? And what is happening to non-disabled women who are experiencing violence? What is going on in your communities to ensure these women are not cast out, which we've seen in communities because of the stigma of disability. So I think, we need to really be thinking deeply at not only helping groups organize, but really encouraging some deeper discussions and really taking more seriously focuses on remedies that we in fact can help support. And I'm in my foyer because of COVID. I will now back up and my husband will come by.
Okay, hola. There we go, our keynote speaker in her foyer. All right, well, thank you so much for that, Judy. And Judy and Ann, you both, again, just led right into our next topic. So, Judy, You co-founded the World Institute on Disability, an NGO here in the US. And you've also served as a special advisor on international disability rights to the Department of State. And you currently oversee the US Department of State's International Disabilities Rights portfolio. And you have also worked internationally at many levels, working with the Paralympics and the Olympic committees. So, to both of you, and of course, Andrea, feel free to jump in as well. So based on your international experience, where does the US stand in the global fight for creation of more accessible spaces? And the second part of that, what can the US teach other countries? And also, what can we in the US learn from other countries about improving accessibility and visibility for people with disabilities? So just a little question.
I think, you know, the US has been a leader in the disability rights arena for many decades. I think, you know, the State Department, as early as the 1970s, was bringing disabled individuals to the United States on visitors programs and others to learn about the emerging movement that was happening. Ann and Andrea will know the late Kala Kunkala, but some of the listeners today may also. Kala, who I actually met in Norway at an international Red Cross youth camp in 1972, went on to become one of the founders of Disabled Peoples International, the founder of an organization called Threshold, which is a center for independent living in Finland, and also set up a foundation called the Abilis Foundation. And we did a lot of work cross countries, sharing information as US laws like 504 and then ADA and IDEA were being developed. The role of state really has been over the years to facilitate discussions back and forth through speakers program and others. So sharing of information, I think, has been very important. And by getting, again, US state and USAID staff involved from the very beginning of their careers and really encouraging people to learn about what's going on in other countries, that enables us to be able to learn from other countries, see what they're doing, as well as sharing information on from us to them. I would say that it's very unfortunate that the US has thus far failed to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. When I was working in the Obama administration with Secretary Clinton and Kerry and President Obama, we were working very hard on trying to get the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities ratified. It was signed by President Obama in 2009, but our failure to be able to get the treaty ratified, I think, really has been weakening our international position because we are unable to participate in formal meetings. For example, we're not able to run someone to be on the committee that oversees the work of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The committee itself really doesn't have authority to make a country do anything, but the committee is very important because it is a sounding board. It is the recipient of reports from governments about what they say are going on and reports from civil society to discuss what is going on from their perspective. And for the committee to be able to give not only critical thought, but also supportive guidance on what needs to be done in areas like inclusive education, which the United States has excelled in for years. We have a lot further to go, but we have a lot of good work that we've done. Independent living, accessible transportation, on and on. And I think our failure to ratify the treaty really ultimately is also limiting opportunities for disabled citizens and residents of the United States to study and work abroad. So it is my hope that as we move forward over the coming years, that we really will be able to see the CRPD ratified by the United States and enabling us to play a more rigorous role, which would allow us to create greater opportunities for people in the US, would allow us to learn more in a more in-depth way about what's going on in other countries, and really in a meaningful way to share our experiences, both from the disability community and from the government side, so that we could help advance the implementation of the CRPD.
Great, thank you, Ann.
And yeah, thank you, Judy. And from the U.S. Department of State's perspective, we recognize the expertise and experience we have in designing, developing, and implementing and enforcing disability rights laws. And we're also asked and called upon to share that expertise by other governments around the world, because we are still looked at as a country that has a lot of experience, many decades of experience doing this work. So we still have a lot of knowledge to share and contribute in this space. And that's one of the responsibilities of those of us who work on the disability rights portfolio, is to make sure that our diplomats know about this history, the disability rights history in the US, the laws that we have on the books, and how they hold up and stand up, against countries' laws around the world, and how much expertise we have to share. And we do that through a variety of different activities. We certainly engage the disabled persons organizations and disability rights communities in countries. We convene meetings between DPOs and their governments, and the U.S. serves as a convener and perhaps helps with technical expertise. We just really try to use and mobilize all the efforts of the U.S. government, from the Bureau of Educational Cultural Affairs exchange programs to our other foreign assistance programs that focus on human rights issues. We just really want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help all of those activists around the world who are working really hard to advance their rights in their countries. So we just want to be partners wherever and however we can in doing that. So.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, did you want to add anything to that? No? Okay, well, great, thank you. So, Andrea, this question goes directly to you, actually, but again, we'd love to hear from Judy and Ann if you'd like. Tell us about the Crip Camp Impact campaign. So that's part of the question, and the second part of the question is, what advice can you share with the global youth audience? Lots of young people with disabilities on this call, listening in. And what's your advice about sharing their stories and engaging and reshaping the disability narrative? Judy mentioned this a while ago, and Ann also, the amazing power of having that footage documented there at Crip Camp. So can you talk more about what's your advice for making sure that message and those images and documents get out, documentation?
Sure. Okay, so your first question was the impact campaign. So the impact campaign, it's kind of a few of the things that I've mentioned, but really the role of an impact campaign overall is really taking a film, a film or a documentary, and then it's kind of like the what's next. And so in our campaign has really been to take the messaging, the powerful messaging of the film, and leveraging it for social change. And so, what are the conversations that need to be happening now? Who are and so like today, just having conversations with Emma and other organizations around bringing the film to their audiences, but also within the disability space, and kind of dissecting all of the different, and there's so much in that 2 hours. And what we've been able to do is really just connect in so many different ways with people and organizations. Like I mentioned, the summer camp that we're doing that was kind of what we consider to be a modern day Crip camp, again, recognizing that we didn't necessarily have the opportunity to come together in person. We have done a host of screenings and panel conversations like these that we're having today with a variety of different organizations and on topics. I mean, we've talked about everything from, disability and sexuality to, again, emphasizing, Blackness and disability, the Black disabled experience. So we have really been able to just have some really cool conversations. And then, we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and partnered with organizations there. But even still, for us, we had three goals. So one was to support and develop emerging leaders. So who are those that they're just beginning in the movement. The other goal was to kind of reconnect and rejuvenate those that have been in the movement for a while. Everybody from Judy to, folks like me that maybe have, been in this work for, 10 years or so. And provide opportunities for us to come together and have conversations. And I can say personally for me that, that's exactly what we're doing. I get to see Ann, I get to see Judy, and I get to see Cindy. And, these are people that over the years we followed and we've seen, but now we get to come together. And so that is doing exactly what the goal is it's I know for me, it's reviving, and, it's exciting to, just be reminded of sometimes even why we do what we do. And then the other is that cross movement building, building across social justice movement. So those are our three goals. And we launched an emergency relief fund in response to COVID, response to COVID-19, and supporting disabled artists and activists that have lost work during this time. And we did that in partnership with a US-based organization, Color of Change, which is the largest online group of for African American or for Black people. And then we have a fellowship program that we've launched as well. So yeah, we just have all kinds of really cool things going on, just to kind of take some of those messages around community and activism and all of those things to continue to move it forward. And think about, what do the next 30 years look like, and how do we plan and grow? In terms of your next question, I think it was advice. Oh goodness, this could go all kinds of different. Yeah.
No, just to I know I asked you a lot at once, but just fresh, what advice can you share to our audience, to our young people, about sharing their stories, engaging, shaping the disability narrative?
Yeah, so I think that, again, what I shared earlier is that for many of us, we have access, and I know that this isn't a global thing, unfortunately, but digital activism is really big because we have our, whatever devices we might, have access to, is really, really great because it allows us to, record with our phones or our computers or, whatever devices we might have and hopefully that are more accessible to us. But there's still, that the power in community, and like Judy said earlier, connecting with the leaders in your communities and in your spaces. And then, to be able to kind of share there and see what opportunities there are, and also creating your own. I think that's what is so great about this current generation, is that there's so much more opportunity to create your own communities and to build from there. So I think that, but using the digital space is a really awesome place to start in terms of your voice just getting out there. I think of so many of the influencers that we now in our community revere, Alice Wong, Annie Sagara. There's so many other what we consider influencers that really started like on Twitter. So many people that don't leave their house and they are literally world renowned, you know, and that's what's so amazing about that. And again, I think in terms of the narrative, the disability narrative, it really is bringing our whole selves into a space. So, you know, for me, I talk a lot about, you know, being a Black disabled woman, and I'm like from the South, and I like fashion, you know, so that brings a different flavor to whatever the perhaps traditional narratives are. But then also speaking our truth, which is, you know, right now, access to healthcare, or we're looking at the, you know, how the COVID response is, and, you know, just things like that. So being able to connect your personal story to what's happening in the world or what's happening in your community, and making it really helping people see what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. Because a lot of times we hear kind of what's happening in the government or what's happening, you know, on a large scale, and people don't understand the impact that it has on our daily lives. And I think that that's, you know, that really is the power of story, and that's what we see in the film.
Great, thank you. Judy or Ann, anything to add to that before we move on to education?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just like to add a little more to what Andrea was talking about. Stories, I think, are so very important, and really looking at, are you gathering stories? Can you tell your own personal story in a way that is empowering not only for you, but for others? I can't speak for Andrea or Ann, but, you know, for me, and I presume for them also, telling our stories, our personal stories, who we are, how our disabilities have impacted our life, how we've been changing over the course of our lives, how easy or difficult it is for us to speak up and out about problems that we're facing, our ability to work with other people to help people tell their stories. Because for me, what you see in Crip Camp and continuing through today, one of the powers that's going on is our ability, and I'm not just talking about in the US, but around the world, the ability of people to go beyond the problem. And I think that's one thing that you see a lot in Crip Camp. There was no organized program. This was not a camp where there was programming that we had to talk about leadership development or anything. That was not a part of the camp. But what was a part of the camp is that evolved out of the camp. We began as young people. A number of the people at the camp were in the same special ed classes that I was. So we saw each other at least until we were 12 years old, every day from, you know, our school days. And we knew our stories, and we knew when we were going to camp that we were also beginning in an age-appropriate way to think about our futures. And our futures at that time in the United States and around the world, but we weren't traveling. There were some people in our camps, you know, had come from Puerto Rico, or very infrequently someone from another country. But what we knew was that the buses weren't accessible, the trains weren't accessible. People didn't talk to us about, oh, what did you want to be when you grew up? But for children, like when they were 4 or 5 years old, people would be talking, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? Those are discussions that weren't really happening with us. So we were really developing those stories ourselves. And we were really looking at, okay, we can't get on a bus, we can't get on a train. These are the barriers, but what is it that we believe needs to happen? And so I think, you know, we began, as you could see, that we felt empowered by the fact that we saw our stories weren't individual, and that we knew that we had to collectively do something. And I think as you see through the film and in your own communities, whatever country you're from, is, you know, we're learning and trying and doing and moving forward. In the US and in other countries, and I think you need to know, you know, the stories in your countries, but there are many revolutions and evolutions that are occurring. We took and take great inspiration from other movements in the United States, from the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the aging movement, the anti-war movement. We were learning a lot from those groups and really learning that we had to believe in what changes we wanted to make. And so we didn't have answers to many questions. We just, as we move forward, we saw that we could expand the community of people that were experiencing the same problems we were, that as we broadened our circle, we learned about how to make buses accessible. We learned about the organizations in government and non-government that were opposing what we were trying to do. We learned how to fight against these organizations, and we learned how to be persistent. You know, as difficult as it was many times, and still is, we really, as a community, committed to being persistent and not allowing no to be something that we would accept. Even if there was a no today, we really believed and believe that we can turn that no into a yes. And this is true for any country. So knowing your story, expressing your stories, allowing civil society to understand the injustices really does allow us to make change.
That's great. Thank you, Judy. I do want to move on to our question about education, but Ann, did you want to add anything to that about telling stories?
Oh, boy, those were beautiful responses. I don't know if I can add more. I think just going back to my own experience, I realized pretty quickly that I had to be able to tell my story in a compelling way that helped people who didn't really want to do what needed to be done make the changes that needed to happen in order for me to be to participate just in my community, in school, in extracurricular activities, whatever it was. So I had to hone that skill, and also had to own responsibility for the fact that this was going to be like a daily ongoing thing, educating people about, you know, my rights and what needed to be done to make it possible for me to be engaged. So yeah, having a really powerful story to tell is, you know, is so helpful in terms of your own advocacy work, an empowering personal story, as Judy said.
Yeah, and we don't have time, but you know, Ann's story about how she got into sports and everything she did, and elaborating on what Andrea has been discussing. I think that's really ultimately, everyone on this call needs to be able to give your own test. Can you tell your story in a compelling way? Can you tell your story as you are getting older and meeting other disabled people and talking with other disabled people and strengthening your story and your commitment?
Yeah, this is Cindy. If I can just throw in one editorial, I just want to note a common thread that you've all said is telling your story in an empowering way, telling your story to bring attention to your rights. You're not saying tell your sad, sad story. And I think that's part of what you're saying is the skill to develop a way to tell your story in a way that makes the point that you want to make, that's not necessarily about your sad, sad story.
It's not necessarily what?
It's not just about your sad, sad story. It's not telling your story about only all the bad things. But anyway, that's a whole topic. Yeah.
No. I think it's an important thing to say. I think it may be important for people to tell their sad story. But the question is, and I think we're all saying this, if you only stay in the sad moment and you don't see yourself as being an empowered person, then you're not going to be able to move forward. You know, many people are living lives that have a lot of tragedy around them. But the issue is, I think, you always need to be able to look at how things can improve. little by little, and how you can do that with other people.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I know that IRN, this is something that's very important to IRN, is talking about storytelling. I'm sure many interesting things will come out of this. And thank you all for that. My next question is about education. And this is acknowledging that today we have a lot of people who are listening in who are passionate about education, either as students or as educators or advocates for education. Judy, you were a teacher, and you were also an assistant secretary at the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation in our U.S. government. Andrea, you have a lot of experience where you've worked with on inclusive curricula, and Ann, I know your work intersects education in so many different ways. So here's my question. What role do those in education play in making changes for disability rights?
Well, I'd say a number of things. One, I learned the other day that in the United States, there are 23 states, and I don't know, this may be new to Ann and Andrea. There are 23 states that actually require that there be some instruction in elementary school or high school on disability rights. And there's a researcher here in the United States who actually uncovered all this information. And I've got the list of the states and I think connections to what the various laws are. So I would say that one of the areas we're wanting to focus on is not just helping disabled people understand our own history, but allowing non-disabled students and teachers to understand disability history, so that a movie like Crip Camp won't be so shocking. Like, why didn't we know this story? Because people would be getting some information, and while they may not know the full story, they would at least be aware that there was a story. I think it's really important that we're looking at inclusive education, meaning that disabled children should be going not only to school, but should be going to school with non-disabled children. I think it's very important for us to be supporting parents through international groups like Inclusion International and local organizations that have been set up by parents to, as disabled adults, help parents work with ministries of education and local school districts to demand that children are going to regular schools with appropriate supports. But we've got to be fighting around the world on segregated education, which typically not only is depriving disabled children of a quality education, but it's also depriving non-disabled children of learning that disability is a normal part of life, and we should be seen in our communities playing various roles. Certainly we've seen this in the States, that the absence of disabled people is kind of either an out of sight, out of mind, or fosters a belief that we are not able to be equal contributors. As those changes are evolving, we are seeing both a more empowered group of younger disabled individuals, but also non-disabled people that are growing up who've experienced being in schools with friends who have disabilities, and recognizing that people may need various supports, but that we should have the same opportunities as others. And then I think we also really have a responsibility to help ensure that we're educating the general population. I think organizations like UNICEF are very important. UNICEF is doing some very, very important work in countries around the world, working with teachers and educators and families and disabled individuals. So this, education, I think, is the backbone in many ways for how our countries in general evolve, and the inclusion of disabled people in effective education is important. I want to say one other point, and that is, Andrea and I had our disabilities when we were young. I presume Andrea was born with her disability. I had polio, and I acquired that when I was like 18 months old. But Ann, as she said earlier, was 16 years old. when she acquired her disability. It's important when we're talking about education or anything that we are not only looking at cross disability and diversity, racial, religious, sexual orientation, etc., but that we also are looking at two other key components. One is the majority of people who acquire their disabilities do so as they are getting older. And that means that this population of people may not have communities that they're aligning with as much as we may have opportunities to, especially if we've been in elementary, high school, or universities. Like Ann, when she went to university, went to a university that had very active disability programs on campus. It was accessible, sports programs, the 9 yards. That's where she was really lucky in being able not to be flailing around, but to meet other people who knew more than she did. And then we have people with invisible disabilities, and we must discuss that. So people with depression, bipolar, anxiety, PTSD, diabetes, lupus, many, many, many different types of invisible disabilities that are also caused for many different reasons. We must discuss those, because when we're talking about our movement and 1 billion disabled people around the world, the 1 billion disabled people are not by any way, shape, or form just people in wheelchairs using crutches or braces, or deaf or hard of hearing, or people with intellectual disabilities. And so I think as our movement evolves, we really need to look at who is missing. We're looking at, for example, when AIDS was in its epidemic stage, many disabled people did not want to get involved with people who had AIDS, although in the United States, people with AIDS are considered to be individuals with disabilities. Being able to address our own stereotypes and our own biases about people who have different types of disabilities, I think is really critically important to allowing us really become the movement that we have the capacity to become.
Okay, great, thank you. Ann, did you want to add anything about education?
I will just add briefly that for all the reasons that Judy discussed, inclusive education is one of the policy issues that we focus on in our disability rights work at the State Department. There are so many issues, right? Policy issues that intersect with disability and that people with disabilities are affected by. But we felt that education, inclusive education, was a really important one, because it really is the backbone or the linchpin to all the other, it's the foundation to all the other work. So I did want to mention that. And working with parents of children with disabilities can be a really effective way to help, help position the issue so that it's addressed. It's important.
Okay,
it's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my next question is about the intersection of working with policy and law and working with our communities and cultures and making cultural shifts. So you have both and still do work in the government. And both of you have also been instrumental in cultural shifts, and certainly Crip Camp is a big part, is resulting in a big cultural shift. So in your experience, how would you say legislative or legal strategies relate to cultural strategies in the fight for disability rights? Do you focus on law? Do you focus on shifting the public perception? How do those things intersect? Judy, you're unmuted, so you get to go first.
I think in part you need to look at your country. Laws are something that all countries have. Some countries have stronger histories than others of having strong laws with strong enforcement provisions. I think for me, and what we've seen in the US and in many countries, we can have a law that has no teeth, which ultimately means not much may happen, or you can have laws with teeth that can be strengthened over time. For me, I think it's very important that we have laws that have teeth. And what does it mean to have teeth? For me, it means that having teeth is there is a requirement on the part of government, and it may depend on where the law was passed. So is it a national law? Is it a culture? Is it a township law? Is it an urban law? Who's got responsibility for ensuring its implementation? And how are we able to ensure that those agencies that have responsibility are really doing their job? How free are we to be able to really speak about things when they are happening correctly and not correctly? I think that's, really very important. So laws are a necessity. Rules, guidance on how to implement those laws. I think it's also very important to be able to have something called technical assistance, meaning the ability to allow people to understand what the purpose of the law is, what the law requires, and who it requires it of. And that when there is a violation, well, there needs to be a complaint procedure. So you have a law, I think there's a need to say, okay, this didn't happen. My child was denied the right to go to school. I was discriminated against, I believe, when I applied for a job. I'm filing a complaint. An appropriate agency needs to have responsibility for investigating that and saying, yes, we agree with you, there was a violation. No, we don't agree with you, there wasn't a violation, or somewhere in the middle. I think people need to know that if a wrong is committed, justice will happen, and how that occurs depends. So for me, I think that's always very important. And the question was law and what?
Cultural shifts. So law, culture.
Law and culture. So I think, I don't believe that you can legislate someone liking me or respecting me. But I do believe that laws can allow people to see that they may not discriminate against me because of their own biases, which then may be denying me an education or employment or the right to marry or whatever. We can, cultures change. And the views that many cultures have around disability is that we are an inferior group of people. That is a premise that I think we can no longer support, nor are we supporting it. One of the reasons why I speak about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is because just the mere fact that that could be a treaty that came into force as a result of the UN coming together, working with disabled people, there was an explicit or implicit understanding that the degree of discrimination that people were experiencing was in many ways, like here, based on people's perceptions for a lack of equality. And so a cultural shift is occurring. Will it occur quickly? No, those kinds of significant changes don't occur quickly, typically for any group. But the fact that we can have laws on the books that are meaningful, that people are learning about and feeling they have a right to utilize, that government and others are taking their responsibility, that will bring about cultural change. Longer period of time than we would like, but that to me is the way we bring about meaningful cultural change.
That's great, thank you. Ann, did you want to add?
I kind of like to look across the 40 years, the past 40 years to see, because on a day-to-day basis, incrementally, it's kind of hard to see. And we often, because of the abysmal employment rate we have in this country, in spite of all the disability rights laws we have in place, is pretty frustrating. And I think it's pretty obvious that that is because of perceptions, negative, the stigma and negative stereotypes toward people with disabilities. because we've removed so many of the other barriers that we used to think were the primary impediments to employment. But looking back over 40 years, when I was, when I first had a disability, the attitudes of Americans toward people with disabilities has completely transformed. Mm. It's not, it's not where it needs to be. There are still lots of challenges, but I can say honestly that if you do the work and do the advocacy, get the laws in place, make sure that they have teeth, as Judy said, and that they're implemented, and that there are resources there to provide technical assistance, the transformation will happen culturally as well. So, and that's feedback that we get from our exchange program participants all the time when they come to the U.S. They notice for the first time, just even arriving at the airport, that they aren't being stared at by other people if they're using a wheelchair or a white cane or whatever if they have a visible disability. And then there are no architectural barriers typically that they experience, in their first few days in the States. So that is just something, I think that's an illustration of just how far we've come. So
I have a friend who has no arms, and she studied at Berkeley. This is in the 80s. So she eats with her feet. And she said she really knew there was something different when she could take off her shoe, get the menu in her foot, and eat, and no one went to throw her out of the restaurant. There's a question over here. What do you think should be done specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic to prevent violence against women with disabilities? I don't know who this is from, but I would ask what is being done in your community to prevent violence against women during this time period. There's, concern in the United States, for example, and other countries that with COVID and many people being locked down, that there is more violence going unreported against women and disabled individuals. So I think this is an issue that we're looking at around the world. And my suggestion would be to see if you could reach out to other women's organizations in your community, find out if this is an issue. And if for some reason it isn't for them, let them know that it is an issue in the disabled women, and seek guidance. I think, it depends on the country that you're living in and how you're required to report. Because I know in some countries you have to go to a police station in order to report. And that in normal times is difficult. If the perpetrator is someone in your family or known to your family, and you're not able to get to report what's happened. So look at this more broadly than disability. Find out what's going on with others and try to work collaboratively with them would be my suggestion.
And this is Cindy. I'm just going to pipe in on that one from my user's perspective. We're hearing from disabled women all around the world, our alumni and other women. This is happening everywhere. It's a huge problem here in the US. And so what I just want to say is that is something that we can learn from other countries. And so I would say really connect with communities, international communities of women with disabilities. Throw this question out there and hear what are some of the innovative things that disabled women are doing around the world. And also, as Judy said, insist that if you support programs for women and domestic women and the issue of domestic violence, or if you belong to a program, belong to an organization like that, insist that women with disabilities are part of that work and that agenda. So thank you for that question. Ann, did you want to add to that at all?
Just briefly, also, if you work with girls and young women with disabilities as an educator or as an advocacy provider or some other service provider, reach out to them, check on how they're doing, offer to go by or to engage with them in a way that's safe, during this pandemic, but kind of putting that effort in can really potentially help them.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to wrangle it back in because we are almost at the end of our time, and I see we have so many questions.
That's what I was going to say, Cindy. Judy, I'm glad you've been looking through the questions. We've received over 30 questions from our Facebook viewers, Facebook Live viewers, and then, of course, our webinar attendees. And our last question does have to do with allies. So I was wondering if we could wrap it into a couple of the questions that have been asked in the chat box. So Cindy, maybe if you want to read the question, and then I can find the two questions that I was particularly thinking of that have been asked in the Q&A.
Okay, that's great. I also want to say Mayusa is having a workshop, a fireside chat workshop on Friday, and we will look at all of these questions and see if we can address any of these questions at that time as well. But this is a very important question for all of the allies out there. So in Crip Camp, the Gened's director, Larry Allison, said, the problem existed with people that did not have disabilities. It was our problem. So the question is, what actions should people with disabilities take to be better allies to people with disabilities? And Emma, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, we had a couple questions. One was from Sakinatu in Cameroon. So she says, I live in a community where we do have disabled people, but they are hidden and hardly seen or heard of. So what strategy can I do to bring out the disabled people and give them voices? And there was another question very similar, and I believe the alumnus was from Bahrain, just helping to be an ally.
Go knock on the door.
Knock on the door.
Invite the person out.
Yeah.
Speak to the leadership of the village or the township or whatever and ask questions. You're not the only one that knows there are people there that are being hidden. So I think it's, not keep it a secret and, really speak to people. There are organizations in the community. Make this a public issue. Do it in a way which enables the individual and their family to feel supported in what, the goal is. And the goal is to recognize the legitimacy of everyone's right to participate in the community, and also to look at what it means to be an ally. So to me, what it means to be an ally is not to keep things like this a secret. I mean, it's a secret that isn't really a secret. We know there are disabled people in the community that don't come out. We know when they're women, disabled or not, that are being abused. We don't report it. We don't, oppose it. Those are the kinds of things that as communities, we need to come together to be allies. And, really, I think to demand that the leadership in our communities be responsive and not complicit.
Okay, Ann?
I would say to also make sure that people with disabilities are part of your power circle or leadership circle, that they're providing direct input about what's important in their lives. So just make sure those voices and those stories are front and center in the work that you're doing.
And the disability groups can be the leaders.
Yeah. And open doors with your influence to decision makers and others, if you have that, or whatever resources and expertise and support you bring to the group.
Yeah, and this is Cindy. I'm going to add my perspective as a non-disabled ally to say it's very important that we listen, that we believe, that we ask questions, and that we do not assume that we know what people with disabilities want and need. I mean, I think we can assume that people with disabilities want equal opportunities and rights, but beyond that, how we get there, I would say listen, believe, and say how can we be of support, and find the leaders in your community who are people with disabilities or working with people with disabilities. Or as you said, Judy, knock on the door, say, hey, where have you been? We'd love to have you join us. What can we do so that you can join us? Judy, did you want to add? No?
No.
Okay, and I just want to say, come to any of the remaining, Emma's going to tell you about the remaining sessions, but I do want to say we hope to see many of you on Friday, some of you at our session, and we'll see what we can do to respond to some of these questions.
Yeah, and
Emma, back to you.
I think let's try to answer one more very quickly. This is for Judy. It's from a Flex alumna from 1997, and she's the former president of the International Federation of Hard of Hearing Young People from 2004 to 2014.
Anna, my youth alum.
Anna, my youth alumna. So she said as she conducted these international camps, she was excited to see in the movie how a camp for youth with disabilities contributed to building a strong community of disability rights activists. But it looks to her, that the key role of youth disability camps in youth empowerment, building self-awareness, teamwork, and self-advocacy skills is still underrated or not fully understood, at least in Europe. So her question is, how does she increase understanding of the importance of such camps for youth so these camps are not seen by donors as merely a fun experience?
Well, let me just say that fun experiences are learning experiences. And so, you know, if in fact there are camps with disabled people only or disabled and non-disabled people where there's a appropriate balance, like 50-50, that learning opportunities can really emerge. And one of the things, as I discussed earlier, about Crip Camp was when we were spending time together, we did begin to create our visions for our future. In the United States, we have something, and it may be called something different in each state, but the youth leadership forums, and they typically bring disabled youth together, I guess 16 to 25, for a 1 week period where they go off-site and spend the nights together with a structured program, as well as opportunities for people just to be able to be together and learn from each other. Different from the camps, which were not as structured, but I think the YLFs have been really important. In the United States, you know, I recently had a discussion with a woman who is now about 28 years old. She's got a significant physical disability, but because of one of our laws, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, she in fact went to included primary, secondary schools, and then was fully integrated also at the university level. But because of that, she really had not met many other disabled people. And when she went to a youth leadership forum meeting in California when she was about 15, she described it the following way: I found my people. It was a very profound effect for her, and I presume in some way, again, not speaking for Ann, but Ann was in rehab, and then she went to the university with all these athletes who were older and knew more than she did. And for me, it was when I was in these other settings where we found people where we felt a common bond. And so I think it's very important. Another issue that I want to raise, which we and other countries are grappling with too, is, you know, we have really appropriately been fighting against segregated workplaces, segregated schools, but finding that middle ground where we can help to ensure that disabled people get to come together. And I think when you look at MyUSA is another excellent, you know, organization, because when disabled people come together in Eugene, Oregon, for however many weeks they come together, they're there for a structured program. But part of what they're doing is also just having time to be with other disabled people with various forms of disabilities, to become friends with people, to break bread together, but also to really learn and study in a way that when they go home, enables them to be stronger leaders.
Thank you for that. And I'm sure this conversation could go on for hours and days. I really appreciate everyone that joined us today, both attendees, our incredible panelists, and of course, Cindy for moderating.